Well, welcome everyone. We definitely appreciate all of you being here with us this afternoon. My name is Jennifer Ponce. I am the program specialist with the Crisis Response Network here with the Orange County Department of Education. My colleague Stephanie Loscko is going to be joining me for this presentation, and we're going to be talking about mental health and emotional well-being, supporting students through critical moments in their lives. And in this presentation, we're going to be talking a lot about how we support students through trauma and traumatic events and crisis. So with that being said, some of the things that we talk about might be a little bit heavy, so please pay attention, to your own thoughts and feelings and emotions as we move throughout this presentation, and we most definitely welcome questions. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So the objectives of today's presentation, we're going to provide an overview of trauma, just so to get a better understanding of what it is, what it looks like, the prevalence of it, how media and especially social media can impact our mental health when critical incidents happen, common responses following a critical incident or a traumatic event. We're also going to talk about some of the warning signs, some of the things that, we really want to watch out for after an event occurs, and also taking a look at some of the warning signs that might be a little bit more serious, or the things that might tell us someone might need a little bit more support. We're going to cover best practice when it comes to, what to say and what not to say. And then we're going to talk about the ways that you as adults can be a safe person in the lives of the children. So to begin, the different types of trauma. There are three different types of trauma, and some of the elements of those are listed out here. But to better understand it, the first type of trauma that we have is what we call acute trauma. So think of an incident that just comes out of the blue, something like a car accident, a random act of violence, injury. That's what we would call an acute traumatic event. Comes out of nowhere and just happens. The next type of trauma is what we call chronic trauma. So think of something that's a little bit more cyclical. So that could be violence in the home, right? Domestic violence. That could be child abuse. That could be bullying. It's something that is continuously reoccurring, something that I am continuously being exposed to. And then we have complex trauma. So complex trauma is, think about chronic trauma, something that's reoccurring, but now we have another traumatic event or element that's layered on top of that. And right now, what we're going through, everyone together with COVID-19, that is a prime example of something that could very easily cause complex trauma, right? So a lot of individuals are experiencing events and just different things in their lives that they might not be used to, or maybe they are living with some of these things happening in their home. And on top of that, we have a pandemic. And on top of that, everything in our world has changed. So when we talk about trauma, one of the things I like to remember is that when a traumatic event occurs or someone's impacted by it, there's this element of loss of control, right? We have no say over what's happening most of the time. And when it comes to loss, we sometimes don't have control over that loss. So as we move throughout this presentation in PowerPoint, we're going to talk about the ways that you and providing support, you're going to be shifting some of that back or empowering the individuals that you're supporting. So just to cover a few statistics to help us understand trauma, one thing we know is that it's common. Every single one of us are going to move through or experience an event in our life that we would perceive to be traumatic, or that might shock us, that might cause a lot of stress in our lives. Nearly 35 million children have experienced at least one traumatic event that could lead to childhood trauma. Like it says here, 72% of children and youth in the US have experienced at least one stressful event before they turn 18. Each year, the number of youth who are requiring hospital treatments for physical assault-related injuries could fill a seat in 9 stadiums. 19% of injured and 12% of physically ill youth have PTSD, and then 54% of US families have been affected by some type of disaster. So these facts and figures, these numbers, they just tell us, how common this is. And like I said, living in this human experience, we're experiencing trauma to some degree in some way, shape, or form. So by the end of this presentation, we want you all to feel empowered and to have the tools to be able to support the students and the young people in your lives. So covering some more of these statistics, what does this look like here in Orange County? It's tragic and sad to report that suicide is the second leading cause of death for children ages 15 to 19 here in Orange County. It's also the second leading cause of death across the nation when it comes to kids. So that's above, illness, accident, things like that. For our younger kids, ages 10 to 14, that is the third leading cause of death for us here in this county. Now, when we talk about the effects of trauma or the impact of trauma, that's going to vary from individual to individual. So, there are different things in our life and different elements that are going to vary the way that this event impacts me and that I might perceive it to be a traumatic event. So, we can take a look at the social context, right, of the event that happened, my own biology, the way that, the way that I perceive things, the way that I move through the world, the way that other stressors have impacted me. Also, developmental level, that's really important when we're working with students because children at different ages and stages are going to process trauma differently. They're going to exhibit different behaviors after a traumatic event. So just being really aware of development when we talk about, something like death and dying, some kids that's not even on their radar, or they don't even have either the language or um, the verbiage to match what they're feeling or what they're experiencing. Has this person experienced trauma in their past? Is there already some fear that is surrounding them around loss or loss of a loved one? I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar with ACEs or the ACE study, where they took a look at what we call adverse childhood experiences. That's a study where there's questions and you can take a look at the experiences that you had in your own life as a child. Some of them being, having a parent that was incarcerated, parents who are divorced, and it gives you a score. And then that score is an indicator of some other things that might manifest later on in life, even illness. And then lastly, the proximity to that traumatic event. So, did I witness it firsthand? Is this secondary trauma? Did someone tell me the story? When we talk about proximity and ripple effect, this is super important because although I might not have been present for the event itself, I could experience what's called secondary trauma. And that could be something like, think about 9/11. That is an excellent example of proximity, ripple effect, and secondary trauma. For a lot of us who are in this workshop, we can remember where we were, who we were with, what we were doing when the news broke of what was happening in New York, right? For a lot of our kids and our children, this is just a story that they're being told, or they're going back and they're seeing some of these historical images. So it's not something that they experience firsthand yet. It can still have a traumatic impact on them, being the people who are learning about this event or who are hearing it. So when something happens, when a critical incident happens, like let's use suicide, for example, we do what's called postvention. So we take a look at everyone else who also might be impacted by this event, who might not have been there to witness or experience it firsthand. This can also be, say your partner is someone who works as a first responder, and then they show up at home after a long day and they're telling you everything they've experienced. And some of these things could be highly traumatic. And then you yourself are being impacted just by secondarily by hearing about these things, right? So not only do we have to be cognizant and aware of the traumatic event itself and those who were there and who were impacted firsthand, but also there are these outliers, just like that drop of water, right? And the ripple effect. So when it comes to trauma and perception, this also has to do a lot with our own variance and our own makeup and who we are as individuals, right? So if a child perceives an event as threatening, there's an increased likelihood that they may experience this as something that is traumatic. And I like to think about riding a bike. For a lot of us, we learned how to ride a bike. Someone took off our training wheels. If we were to fall off our bike now, like, yes, it would be harmful. It would probably hurt. It could be traumatic. But for a child who's learning how to ride a bike, that first fall could very well be the first traumatic event that they experience. And even though we may look at something like that as being very minor and small, where we are now, for that child, that could be something that they're going to remember for the rest of their life. So when it comes to perception of trauma, and this is really important as we cover some of the best practice, remember some of these things because the way we experience it is just so different. So the nature of the crisis itself, like, what happened? My exposure to it, was it firsthand? Was it secondary? What is my relationship with the folks who have been impacted or those who might have passed away? When I'm a child, I'm going to look around to the adults in my life. What does their reaction look like? How are they coping with the stress? How are they coping and moving through the trauma or the healing or the grief process? And then just, just me as a person, my own individual being, my own vulnerability. Where am I in life? What types of trauma have I experienced in the past? Am I someone who lives with chronic trauma or complex trauma?
Okay, so now we're going to shift over to Gen Z. And this was a report that I was sharing in the plenary, if you were there with me. But this is from the American Psychological Association. And this report is about stress in America. And this one was from 2018, so just 2 years ago. And our Gen Z students who are now 18 to 23 were citing things like gun violence, immigration. They were most likely to report poor mental health. And my apologies. Let's see if this will work. Perfect. And the percentages of those youth who were feeling stressed by national news are in this slide here. And again, I apologize. Jen, can you help me go back? It's not, yeah, I'm just going to say next slide if you don't mind. Okay, perfect. So these were the percentages of youth who are feeling stressed by issues in the national news in that 2018 report. And you can see, 75% of Gen Zs who took the survey said mass shootings were a huge thing. The rise in suicide rates, like climate change and global warming, separation at the border, widespread sexual harassment. Next slide. But now here we are 2 years later in a global pandemic with the same youth who are now experiencing even more stress and adversity and things in the news, locally, nationally, globally, that are incredibly stressful. And so this report that came out just last year, they titled it a national mental health crisis. And they did so because that's what we're in. A lot of folks are reporting that COVID-19 has been a significant stressor. And like I was saying in the plenary, we know that long-term chronic stress is really, really negative on our physical and mental health and can have long-term implications. Next slide. I shared this bottom graph as well with you all there, but we can see the variation in generations and how they are taking on this stress. So it seems that older generations have more of a, this too shall pass mentality. And that can be because maybe we're a little bit older, we've gone through some different adversities, and we can kind of see that light at the end of the tunnel. But for our younger folks, for our Gen Z adults now who are 18 to 23, we are seeing this continual rise in stress. And certainly this last year was no exception. If anything, it increased the stress, definitely. But that could be because they have only spent this is a very big portion of their overall life. And so it feels more daunting, especially at a time when this should be an exciting new opportunity to take on that next step into adulthood. And there's kind of this looming cloud over them of uncertainty. I think it's important too that we look at how the pandemic is impacting our Gen Z teens, so ages 13 to 17, and we have half of them saying planning for the future feels impossible now. And that the pandemic has severely disrupted their plans for the future, which can, contribute to this hopelessness, which is very concerning, especially for our students who have suicidal ideation. Next slide. Thank you. So media coverage in mental health, this is a huge portion because, the majority of our time spent now is at home on screens. And so before the pandemic hit, this was something that we were already looking at as a serious implication to mental health. But now more than ever, we have to take a look at our consumption of mental health, our consumption of media coverage, and how it's impacting our mental health. And so here you can see cumulative exposure to news accounts of extreme violence, suffering, things like that can lead to psychological stress. And so, I look at this as kind of a roller coaster. We had that initial shutdown, and that was a huge drop. And then, everything started, the summer came around and we saw declining cases, and then we had them shoot up again. We see these new variants, we're having the vaccine roll out. We've also had to endure lockdowns and then reopening. So these transitions back and forth, but with all of that comes news headlines, right? And so we know unrestricted access to media coverage can be worrisome in the smartphone era. I know Jennifer was talking about 9/11, and certainly, during that time, we did not have a little mini computer that we were carrying around with us at all times. And so it is a little more concerning now that we can be so connected to something that has such a great impact on our lives, and every single update at every hour of the day, that is too much for anybody, but especially for our youth, because it is not developmentally appropriate for them given where they're at in their development. So studies are finding that media exposure can be positively associated with post-traumatic stress symptoms following a traumatic event. And this, again, this is an ongoing crisis. But with every new headline, with those ebbs and flows, we are seeing the opportunity for that increase in stress again. And then, example, following a school shooting, the idea of safety can change drastically for students. There's a new sense of vulnerability. And so I remember with Sandy Hook and even with Parkland, right, with our youth, that sense of safety at school shifted for a lot of them. And so if we're thinking about COVID-19 and what that means as we're reopening, which certainly is going to be helpful for their mental health because that connection is so important for them, we also have to think about the youth who maybe are concerned about going back to school and what that means for themselves, their families, their teachers. And we have to meet them where they're at with that potential anxiety for what that transition is going to look like. So of course it can be hopeful and exciting, and yes, we want to get back to our new normal, but let's consider what that transition could do to our students with anxiety and stress about what that means. Next slide. And so we want to be able to identify and address psychological and behavioral impacts of trauma. And so this is by development, which I think is really important depending on the age of youth that you're working with. It's important to know what you should be looking for. So for preschool children, we're seeing things like separation anxiety, clinging to a teacher or primary caregiver, regression in previously mastered stages of development. So maybe we're seeing bedwetting again, recreating the traumatic event. So, we were out on a response one time, and what had happened is a small child, preschool age child, had fallen down and fainted in class. And they had to be taken away on a gurney. And what the students started doing was going up into that place and falling down and recreating the event. And that is thematic play. But if you don't know what that is, which the teachers did not, it can feel very disturbing to see that for the first time. So it's important to know that that is sometimes how students of that age who don't know how to verbalize what they're doing, what they're feeling, will recreate and process in that way. New fears, questions about death and dying. For elementary school children, we can see any of those things, but we can also see worry about recurrence of violence or sudden distrust, somatic complaints, so tummy aches, headaches, things that can't be explained by any kind of illness. They're just kind of happening. Changes in school performance and attendance, and then hyperarousal, so sleep disturbances, tendency to be easily startled by a bell or a knock on the door, things like that. Next slide. And then middle school children, we're seeing discomfort with feelings such as troubling thoughts of revenge, maybe repeated discussion of event and focusing on specific details. So it's that constant retelling because they're trying to process what has happened. Avoidance of behaviors and places that remind them of maybe something that was part of the event. And in high school and adolescence, we see anxiety, fear, worry about the safety of themselves, but also for others. So this could be them worrying about their teachers, worrying about getting somebody sick if they were exposed, right? Irritability with friends, teachers, caregivers, increase impulsivity, so risk-taking behaviors, potentially some substance use that could be to cope, and then repetitive thoughts and comments about death or dying. So next slide. And I will say that this is normal, right? Following that initial traumatic event or that initial rise in hypervigilance around a new guideline with COVID-19 or around a new finding or like with the new variants, right? We will see that short-term distress, which is almost universal following a critical incident or that new information potentially that is stressful. And so we just want to be aware of those distress responses, what make them worse, what make them better. Integrate healthy coping mechanisms into our daily routines while our child or student is experiencing this change. And I will say modeling is one of the most effective things we can do with our youth. They will do what we do. And so it can be difficult to integrate these things into our lives that would make us healthier too, because because we are so busy and we're wearing so many hats. But I promise you, it would be a really effective strategy in helping your youth find ways that are healthy to cope with this experience, and then monitor symptoms. And they should fade within 2 weeks after that short-term distress is elevated once again. But if they don't go away after those 2 weeks, that's when we start becoming more concerned, and we know that we need to definitely seek out more support. And Jennifer will go over that a little bit more in the following slides.
Thank you, Stephanie. So when we're talking about grief and grieving, as Stephanie mentioned, those are some of the common responses that our children may have to grief or to a traumatic event. And sometimes as a support person, that can feel very heavy, or sometimes we ourselves might not know what to do initially, which is perfectly okay. That's normal too. But we want to remember to extend grace not only to ourselves, but also for this person, because we know that healing is not linear and nor experiencing trauma or grief. So this is an awesome slide because this not only talks about the response itself, some of the things Stephanie mentioned and what it looks like, but these are also some very simple things that you can encourage someone to do. And as I mentioned earlier, when we think about trauma, sometimes we think about the loss of control. So someone who is moving through the grieving process, we're going to want to be there as that support person to shift as much power as we can back. We want to provide stability. We want to be a safe individual. And I think sometimes if we keep that in mind, it helps us when these things occur and maybe we're like, you know what, I really don't know what to do or say. That is 100% okay. But just keep that in mind, and keep that in mind as we move through the best practices of what to say and what not to say. So, if someone is showing up and you can tell that they are in shock, right? So they are just dazed, they seem out of it. You can encourage them to talk to someone to get some rest, right? If someone seems like they're searching, they're having these emotional up and down, same thing. Try to encourage them to talk to someone. Maybe they can go outside and take a walk. Someone who has a lot of anxiety, they might just have all of this worry all of a sudden, or maybe this is the first time that they ever question like their own mortality or thought about it. Encourage them to avoid some impulsive decisions, right? Like wanting to leave or go somewhere quickly, or making some drastic decisions. Encourage them also to connect with the safe individuals that they have in their lives. Someone might show up and just be extremely angry, right? Angry at the circumstances, angry at the individual, angry at something that they don't even know why. Journaling is awesome. And with a lot of the teens and the youth that I've worked with, especially the ones who maybe aren't as open or feel like they can't go to their parents with some of the things that they're thinking and feeling, or maybe they haven't even made sense of those emotions yet. I always talk to them about journaling and think if it's something that they considered. And for most of, especially teens, they're like, that's an awesome idea because it gives them this safe space where they can just write out, and it helps them to be able to release whatever it is that they're thinking and feeling. And sometimes in that, they start to identify, they start to be able to just release, and it opens the door too for them to be able to share. Guilt and regret, that one is also very common. I hear a lot of this when it comes especially to like a suicide of someone who might be their friend. There's this guilt surrounding, maybe I could have done something, maybe I could have intervened in some way. We also, some of us have heard of survivor's guilt. So maybe there's something like a natural disaster, or there's a car accident and I lived and no one else did. It's very common for people to carry a lot of guilt and a lot of regret, and we want to encourage them to extend grace to themselves, right? Maybe focus on what would the other folks who are involved, what would they say? Encourage them also to talk to someone, but to more importantly, to be forgiving and to understand that it wasn't their fault. They may feel empty and numb, and sometimes that goes back to that shock and disbelief, just being in a daze, right? Not knowing where to go, what to do, who to turn to. Sometimes that is tied to a lot of really deep emotion of sadness. Also, you may see people who are returning and just looks like nothing happened, or they were impacted in no way, shape, or form, right? That's okay too. That is perfectly normal. One thing we know about grief and trauma is that we're all going to respond in a different way, shape, or form, and that is perfectly okay. So this is just to be aware of some common pitfalls. And I say these things are common because these are things that we naturally want to do as helpers, especially if these children or these students are people that we love and care for. So as I mentioned, please extend some of this grace to ourselves as we do what we can to be that support individual, but some things we can be aware of. So We just don't want to assume that all children are going to respond in the exact same way. As Stephanie was mentioning, there's some kids who may act out the event because they might not have the language. There's some children who are going to start to regress, or maybe they're going to want to be around mom and dad. For some of our teens, they might shut down. For some of them, they might overperform. We just can't make that assumption that everyone's going to react the same. Also, we don't want to make them feel like these reactions that they're having are abnormal. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid saying like, oh, well, this shouldn't be impacting you in that way, or pathologizing it, right? We don't want them to feel like something is wrong, because this is a perfectly normal response to an incident that occurred. Also, we don't want to convey the message that this is going to cause long-term effects, because it may not. They may just exhibit these things for a time. They may move through it. And for someone who might be exhibiting some of the some more or longer lasting effects, we want to support them in getting resources and getting the support that they need. But we definitely don't want to make them feel the extra pressure of this is something that's not going to go away, or it's permanently going to affect them. We also don't want to assume that all children are going to need treatment. That goes back to assuming that they're going to respond in the same way. Some children may move through this and come out perfectly fine, and you see some of that resiliency. Some children may need a little bit additional support, and that's okay. We also, as I mentioned, we don't want to create a situation where children have little choice or control. So maintaining as much consistency and normalcy and routine is crucial, because when someone has experienced trauma, they're going to be seeking and searching for the things that they know are normal in their life. And that's going to empower them to move through this process, because they know that everything else in their world right now is safe. And it gives them the opportunity to just focus on the emotion at hand and what they're experiencing. We also don't want to force people to tell their story. I am a firm believer that when we experience something that we perceive to be traumatizing or traumatic, we are the owner of that story. We are the owner of our emotions. So it is up to them where and when they would like to share. Here are just some warning signs. Some of the things that Stephanie mentioned, very normal, right? And as she said, these things should subside within a couple of weeks, and maybe it may go shorter, it may go longer, but we definitely want to be aware if something looks like it's more of a severe reaction. So maybe this is having a bigger impact than we thought, or maybe this child is needing some additional support. So if you notice that they start to withdraw from their peer relationship, so maybe they loved hanging out with their friends, they were part of a sports team, they were always with their family, and now all of a sudden this child just wants to be in their room, right? Doors closed, they don't want to talk to anyone. All of a sudden they're isolating. Maybe they're not interested in the activities that they did. They no longer want to play that sport. They no longer want to hang out with their friends, or go and do the activities that they once enjoyed. Maybe they're acting out a little bit more. You notice that their attitude just and their moods seem off. Maybe they're a little bit more aggressive, and it's starting to strain your family and impact maybe other relationships as well. Maybe they're struggling in school. They're not going to school anymore. Their grades are dropping. They're having a hard time focusing, or turning in homework. The way they're doing on tests, it's very poor, So also physical complaints, as Stephanie mentioned, some of those things like having a stomach ache, no desire to eat. Maybe they're eating a lot more. Maybe they're sleeping a lot more, sleeping less, complaining of things like headache. These things are very common, but also we definitely want to keep an eye on them to make sure that it's not something that's prolonged or it looks like it's extremely severe. You can also pay attention to appearance. Like maybe this person has all of a sudden like dropped weight super closely, or gained, or same with their sleeping habits, as I mentioned earlier. Negative or maladaptive coping, as Stephanie mentioned, we as adults, we are the prime example in the lives of our children. So, and of any child that's in our life. And a lot of times they're going to be looking to us. So we definitely want to make sure that we're setting good examples, but also keeping an eye out for things like, drinking, substance use and abuse, that definitely can have a negative impact further on. So if you see some of these things, this is when you're going to want to get some additional help. If they're threatening to hurt themselves or harm others, if this person is not normally, but regularly having nightmares, a lot of fears all of a sudden, if you see them continuing to play and reenact, or you notice that they're just renumerating on the events over and over and over again, difficulty with sleeping, as I mentioned, maybe now they have this really increased startle response, like the bell rings or someone brushes up against them, or also I'm going to say an under response, something that normally should have aroused them or startled them, and you just notice that they're completely out of it. And then that regression behavior, those things should subside. But if you notice that it's prolonged, thumb sucking, bedwetting, wanting to sleep with mom and dad, all of a sudden now they're afraid of the dark, whereas they weren't before. as we move through these slides, I want you just to remember, like, there's no perfect way or science. And a lot of our responses and our reactions are 100% normal. And I guarantee the things that are on that don't say this side are things that I have absolutely said in an effort. And even though the intention was wonderful, there's a difference between impact and intent. And so we want to remember that here, because sometimes our words can have a totally different impact than the intent that we had going in. So keeping that in mind, and also keeping in mind that element of shifting power back, that's what we want to do with anyone who's experienced a traumatic event. So we might feel inclined to say something like, I know just what you're going through. And especially if it is something that you've experienced, maybe you lost your mom when you were very young and this child has just lost their mom. It's very normal to want to say something like that, but we definitely don't want to do that, because everyone's experience, as I mentioned, is so unique to them. So what you can say instead is, tell me more about what this has been like for you. That gives them the opportunity to choose what they want to share. Also, you must be incredibly angry. Sometimes it's normal to almost prescribe an emotion or a thought or something, some reaction that might not be in line with the way that they're feeling. That again might make them feel a little bit off, or like, wait, maybe I'm doing something wrong here, because that's not how I am perceiving this, right? So another thing you can say is, most people have strong feelings when it comes to something like this. So what's that been like for you? Sometimes we want to say something like, this is hard, but it's also important to remember the good things in life too. As Stephanie mentioned, especially for older generations, it's more of that, hey, let's take a look at the silver lining. Things could be worse, which is very well true, but we definitely don't want to do that in these instances, because at this time and in this moment, that's not where they're at. And maybe they're not seeing the bright side of things. And you don't want to give that added extra pressure that they need to, right? Or that they should be feeling a certain way. So something else you can say, what kinds of memories do you have about this person who's died? I lost both my parents when I was your age. Again, that's another example of that. The intent is awesome, but it can definitely cause unintended harm or just a little bit more emotional weight that we don't want to give. So tell me more about what this has been like for you is a better response. You'll need to be strong now for your family. It's important to get a grip on your feelings. Again, we are assigning them not only an emotion, we're assigning them a task. So you need to get a grip on your feelings, and you're giving them the way that they should be responding, which, as I mentioned, may not be in line, and that might make things a little bit worse. Also, I will say, sometimes when we say some of the stuff that's on the left, it can cause that individual to shut down. And what we want to do is create an environment where they're safe, so that that's not what's happening. A better question can be, how's your family doing? What kinds of concerns do you have about them? And last, at least they're no longer in pain. Again, that's in an effort to take a look at the bright side, the positive things. Um, but as I mentioned, they just might not be there at this moment. So something else you can say is, what sorts of things have you been thinking about since your loved one died?
Okay, so some tips for reestablishing security and stability. These are tips for adults. So we're going to go over some of these. Recognizing that problem behaviors can be manifestations of that trauma-related anxiety. We have to be sensitive and monitor those changes. Helping children manage feelings by teaching and modeling effective coping. I went over this earlier. Again, no easy feat, because we are also experiencing this increased stress. But starting with small things, or going back to the basics, like our sleep, our eating patterns, our exercise, that media consumption, again, right? Those things are really important to be modeling right now, and they will help our mental health and our physical health. Answering questions related to the traumatic event in honest, developmentally appropriate language and terms. And we actually have some resources that we would be happy to share with you. They are one is from the Dougie Center. That's really great. And it gives kind of the response developmentally, what that might look like in each student, and then how you can respond in an effective way. So if anybody's interested in that, we can for sure send that your way. But it's important to know how to navigate those conversations, and what to know, and how to know what developmentally we need to be responding with, so that it sinks in and is helpful for them, and it doesn't go over their head. Create clear, concrete school and home safety plans with children. This can be really important. Engage them in activities that stimulate their mind and body. So again, giving them other opportunities that would help them to kind of just reestablish that control. That's the biggest thing with trauma, is where we feel out of control. So there's a way that we can go ahead and regain that control for them a little bit anyway. It's going to have really positive effects. Expand their feelings and vocabulary so they can more easily express themselves. We were talking about this in the plenary too, but not every student knows exactly what they're feeling, right? They might be feeling a certain way, but they've never felt that way before. And so they don't know how to express it. And so how do we provide them with opportunities, maybe feeling charts or different ways that they can start exploring those feelings and then better verbalize what they need or what they're feeling. Promote activities to bring them closer to the ones that they trust. So doing things at home, watching movies together, playing games after dinner, things like this that can just offer time for quality connection. Maintain usual routines. This is we're gonna have to be flexible with this, right? Because with the closing and opening of certain things due to the pandemic, we have to be flexible in what those routines look like. Once something changes though, it's important to establish a new routine right away. Make sure that we're talking about how the transition could affect us, right? How it might be not feel great in that transition, but how we're going to establish this new routine. And in a couple of weeks, everything should pretty much calm down. Be aware of your own emotional reactions to a critical incident and seek support. So, I don't know if any of you have ever seen, what is that movie? Is it with Ron Burgundy? Jennifer, help me out.
Weatherman?
Yes. And so it's, he's in the glass case of emotions, like, we don't want to sob in front of our youth. We don't want to show them an immense emotional reaction, but we do want to model what a healthy emotional reaction is, right? I think a lot of time our parents and our teachers, well-intentioned, right? Again, they want to be the rock. They want to make sure that their students feel safe. I totally understand. But showing some of the emotions, the healthy emotions, modeling that for them can be really effective. And when we are in that place, we're in a glass case of emotions, we need to reach out and make sure that we're getting the support that we need to. Next slide. Okay, so we're also going to be allowing children to tell the story as they see it so they can release emotions and try to make sense of what is happening. And oftentimes it also includes retelling of the story. So we have to kind of get set and let them retell it a few different times because that's how they process it. Respond calmly and compassionately without displaying shock or judgment. So I say, the deer in the head look, the headlights look, the like, oh my gosh, what is this? Oh, what are you telling me? It's scary. I understand that sometimes some of the emotions that come through for students that we're hearing for the first time can be incredibly scary, but let's prepare for that. Let's prepare for it before a conversation, whether that's by talking to a friend, someone at school, another adult, to kind of prepare for what might come up and how we're going to respond so that we can try to make sure that we are calm and in control, because that's going to show that student that they can come to you with scary things, with big things, and they don't have to feel scared or concerned for your feelings. Because sometimes our older students, like we said, they're scared for you, they're feeling for other folks. And so they turn into the caregiver, and we want to make sure that they know that we are calm, we are here to support, and that's our role. So respond, and then also without judgment, right? We don't want to judge. Reassure children that adults in their life are working to keep them safe, that we're doing everything possible. Set boundaries and limits with consistency and patience. Remind them repeatedly how much you care. That might seem really simple, but that's needed more than ever now. Give them choices to regain that sense of control. Like I said, anticipate challenging situations that may remind them of the event and provide additional support as needed. So again, social media posts, anniversaries. We're at the 1 year anniversary, just about, of COVID-19. So I would imagine that anniversary blues is going to be a new pattern, new thing that we see coming up for not just youth, but for adults as well, because we can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we're not quite out of the woods just yet. So the anniversary blues may be part of that, and that new stress, that new reaction that we have to make sure that we're managing and helping people manage over the next couple weeks. And then provide children acting out with the opportunity to redirect that energy in a helpful way. That can be through reaching out to connections at school and asking if there's leadership opportunities. It could be a new role at home. It could be having conversations about what that might look like, but making sure that they have that opportunity to redirect that energy. So John Gottman is a researcher on trust. And his whole research is based on, these smaller interactions rather than the grand gestures that we usually think of, are what build trust and what break trust. He calls them sliding door moments. And yes, if you're thinking of the movie with Gwyneth Paltrow, you are right. I apologize for the spoilers, but if you've ever seen this movie, or you haven't seen this movie, it's important context. So Gwyneth Paltrow is running for the train. She's about to get on the train and the door shuts on her, right? And she doesn't get on. And then in another slide, she does get on the train. And depending on what happens in that split second is kind of what determines her ending. And so we want to make sure that we are taking the opportunity, right, in those sliding door moments to build trust, not betray. And so, it's small things that we really don't think of. It's that conversation as we're riding in the car. It's that small interaction over breakfast. It's as we're getting water in the kitchen at 9 o'clock before we go to bed, right? It's, John Gottman talks about too, he was in his bed reading a novel. He was at the very end of it. He was so excited to finish it. He's getting up to get ready to go for bed so that he can get back in and finish his novel. He's so excited. But he looks in the mirror and his wife is just sitting there brushing her hair and she looks very, very sad. She's just distraught. And he can tell, right? Because we know ourselves and we know our family members and we can tell when there's something going on. And so he had the moment that sliding door moment, right? Where he could build trust, make sure he puts his novel aside for a second and engages in a conversation of how are you, what's going on, versus ignoring that and thinking she's probably just going through something. It's no big deal. We'll talk tomorrow. Right. Those opportunities, if we're not offering the opportunity to build trust in those small moments, what we're doing is eroding that trust away. And in this time, especially when we're all going through something really stressful, like COVID-19, we need to make sure that we're capitalizing on those moments to build that trust more and more and more. So that is just a kind of a call to action to all of us to check in with ourselves and make sure that we're doing that with ourselves, with our families, and especially with our youth. Next slide. And finally, self-care, we can't say it enough. This is so important. So taking good care of you means the people in your life will receive the best of you rather than what's left of you. That's Lorraine Cohen. I often quote this because it has always rung so true for me. We will have resources on the next slide that you can utilize if you feel so. These are Orange County resources, so I apologize if anybody in this session is not from Orange County. We can certainly help find other resources if you need, but these are really important to lean into. And, often people hesitate to lean into resources for a number of reasons, but like we were talking about in the plenary, mental health stigma is still a big part of that. And, if you broke a leg, you wouldn't wait 2-3 weeks to go to the doctor, right? And you certainly wouldn't wait. What we're seeing right now for that first symptom of mental health condition is that delay of like 8 to 11 years, which is insane. There's no way if you broke your leg, you would not wait 11 years to go to the doctor, right? It would be way more severe. You wouldn't be able to walk. And the same is true for our mental health. So we have to make sure we are having conversations and normalizing mental health the same way we do physical health so that people can get support sooner, so that we can get support sooner if we really need it. So here are some resources to help with that in the interim. If you need anything else, you can definitely let us know. But I hope that you use resources, but also find ways to indulge in some self-care here and there so that, again, you can give the best of you rather than what's left of you. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, we're going to open up our Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box and I can read them off. One that got sent to me was for those moments that are like the anniversary moments or the expected moments, what is the best way to handle those sorts of things? Is it to dig into it or to kind of just bring peace or those sorts of things?
Jennifer, would you like to take that question or would you like me to?
Yeah, I think maybe both of us could respond to that because when it comes to anniversary, sometimes that is something that we can prepare for. I mean, as Stephanie mentioned, we're coming on the anniversary of COVID, of our whole lives changing. Also, there were some pretty other significant events that took place, such as like, the helicopter crash with Kobe. And in our own personal lives, when that comes around, a lot of memories come with it. So I think just preparing yourself, giving yourself grace and being prepared. So when that time comes, sometimes we don't know, even we don't know how we're going to respond, we don't know the impact that it's going to have, but I think having some of those safeguards, some of those resources, your friends, your self-care plan laid out for you can definitely be helpful. And when you're working with a group and supporting students through that, exploring ways too that they can either memorialize or remember, and giving them the space to do so.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And we don't talk about anniversary blues enough as something that comes up for folks. So I think it's important to have this conversation now, but right before we get into it, and then really just be watching out for what we see in our youth. Are those symptoms coming up? If we're not seeing that increased stress or that distress response, then maybe they're not experiencing anniversary blues, and that's totally fine. But for the folks who are, we need to just be a little more hyper aware and hyper vigilant of identifying that as a change in their behavior, and then addressing it sooner than later with some of those tips that we talked about to readdress stability and security.
Okay, another one on here is, how do you know when you should reach out to someone to seek mental health care?
That is a great question because it's going to be unique to everybody, right? I would ask you to, emotional health is on a scale. And so we kind of have to know, and I do this in my workshop with our students, as we talk about how mental health and physical health are the same, are similar, right? Or they're interconnected, and how we have to think about it as like a temperature. So my temperature is 98.7. So that's my resting temperature when I'm not sick, when I'm healthy, and I feel kind of, that's like my balance. But if I get a fever, I start to feel those symptoms, right? Like I'll start getting hotter, and my throat might get sore, I get a headache, and I know I need to take Advil or go to the doctor. Or like if I'm outside in the snow, I don't have the right gear on, I start getting cold, getting chills, I might be starting to get hypothermia. I have a good understanding of what happens to my body when I'm physically ill or something's wrong. Now, with mental health, we have not invested in this prevention and education enough. Like, we're doing it now, and certainly we've made strides towards it. But what I would ask you to do is try to start exploring different resources around education on what mental health looks like and what those signs and symptoms look like when you're having some kind of mental health concern, and what it looks like when it's more severe. Again, that simple 2-week time frame, if you are having symptoms outside of your normal balance relative to you, and those are prolonged beyond 2 weeks, and they're not getting better or they're getting more severe, that is definitely an indicator that it's time to reach out for help. Obviously, too, if you're having any thoughts of suicide, hopelessness, you find that you're, withdrawing from friends and family, you have just kind of an irritability about you, those changes in mood and behavior are really important to pick up on. Sometimes it's hard for us to see that too. So if you're concerned, I would ask somebody who you're close with, hey, have I changed at all lately? Has there been a difference? I feel a difference in my mood, but I want to check in because I'm not quite sure, and I need to know if it's time to reach out for support. So I would say all of those things are really important, but really it's understanding our own mental health and what our balance looks like, what our mental health temperature looks like, if you will, so that we know when it's time to start getting help. Jennifer, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, Stephanie. I definitely agree. I would agree with that. Knowing your baseline. And that being said, I'm a true preventionist at heart. And I think having these conversations is so crucial, knowing what's there, knowing what help is available to you. And even, speaking with your own insurance provider can be an awesome tool, and just saying, hey, I just wanted to know, what are the resources in my area, what's covered and what's not covered, just so that you have that information there, whether you need to or choose to use it or not. And then I would also add checking in with your family members, because stigma is something that is deeply embedded and rooted in our culture, and sometimes just in our family systems in general. So I think opening the door and having that dialogue can definitely help, and especially if there's a critical incident that just comes out of the blue. And that way you're kind of prepared to have the conversation. You are in tune and in touch with your own emotions. As Stephanie mentioned, you know your baseline. And if you ever notice that something is impacting, and I will say a lot of times we are going to respond normally and naturally to something that happened to us, right? And that is a-okay. But if you do notice that all this is impacting my life in a way that's so much more strenuous, like I'm not able to go to work anymore, I'm not enjoying the things that I did, that definitely can be an indicator that this has had more of a severe impact and that, you know, I should talk to someone. And just as you said, Stephanie, if you notice that you are in a moment of crisis, please do not hesitate to reach out, pick up that phone and call like the crisis line. You can always call emergency services, you can call a friend, but please don't hold that secret.
There's another question that is about validation of like helping someone who is suffering from abuse, who doesn't feel validated by the ones around them. What can you say to support and validate the person?
I read through that question in the chat. And I appreciate you bringing that up because as you mentioned here, I know it's a little bit lengthy, but you were talking about essentially, you know, what we would call family violence, right? So dad being mean to two brothers in the home. One is moving through this experience and has it in their own way. And then this other is being more greatly impacted, right? That is something that can be very common. And even though it's a prime example, as we talked about, you have two individuals who are having the exact same experience, yet this person is feeling deeply impacted and needing more validation. And maybe when there comes to bullying and it comes to abuse, there's a lot of what we call crazy making that's happening in these instances, right? Because abuse and bullying is also about dominance, power, and control. So just as trauma takes away power and control, abuse, bullying behaviors, that's eliminating power and control as well. So for some individuals, we may want to protect ourselves. And in that, we are going to move through that experience in a different way. And when we have the dynamic of a family member who might be inflicting that, for my own self-preservation, it's very easy to minimize. You know, when we look at people who have survived abuse and that form of trauma or intimate partner violence, it's very easy to either, you know, to minimize, to question, but you have to remember that that person has already kind of been set up to question their reality in those moments. So for that one brother, they may be questioning, they may be minimizing. And then for this other brother, here we see that they're heavily impacted and they're like, no, this is harmful, this is hurting me, and they can't go to their brother because they're in a whole different space. So this is a prime example of the way that trauma can be experienced in two different ways. So, and if you're like thinking about supporting and validating, that's so important. So for the one brother who you mentioned who is needing the extra support, just being there, listening. You as an outside source can definitely validate, normalize the experience. And when it comes to survivors of abuse or bullying behaviors, one of the things I would always encourage is to listen and to believe them. Don't question, allow them to own the story and share it in whatever way, shape, or form. And when it comes to family violence or any type of trauma, we as the support people can find some resources, some really great, you know, tools that you have so that you can assist them. And if they're living in a situation like that, you can help them safety plan, right? So when dad starts acting out, what can you do to ensure your safety, and not just like physical safety, your emotional safety? Like, hey, you know what? If your dad starts going out of control, text me the word Starbucks. When you do that, I'm going to go meet you at Starbucks or at Target, and I'm going to pick you up and we're going to go to the movies, or right now in COVID, you know, we're going to go for a walk. We're going to go to the park. Like, I will be there for you. So there's a lot of ways that you can validate just by, you know, listening, being the support person, withholding judgment, but more than anything, like affirming that experience that they're having, while also kind of allowing space for whatever that other brother is going through. Because one thing we know, you know, when it comes to abuse, trauma, anything, two truths can be true at once. That's important to remember. Two truths can be true at once, and we can show up for people in the way that's best going to support them. And that's a long answer, Stephanie.
Perfect. I have nothing to add.
Okay. I got another one that says, if there is someone who has struggled with sexual abuse trauma as a child, does it make a difference to reach out for help in understanding as an adult? And does it make a difference if this conversation is never talked about?
Jennifer, would you like to take this one as well?
Sure. First and foremost, anyone who is a sexual abuse survivor that is speaking up or reconciling or remember is very brave. That is a very brave thing to do. And if it is something that someone has experienced as a child, that is very unfortunate. But sometimes when it comes to trauma or victimization in any way, shape, or form, when you are ready to experience it, to feel it, to identify it, to put language to it, that's on your timeline. And that is okay. So if this is something that you've experienced in your past as a child, and now it's either come to the forefront or as an adult, you feel ready or compelled to address it, that is perfectly fine. Because as I mentioned, there's no timeline. There's no timeline for healing. And in our own journey, especially when something like this has happened to you, as we mentioned, that power and that control has been stripped away. And throughout your life, people move through trying to regain some of that power and control. And speaking up, seeking help can be some of those moments that are definitely very empowering as you move through the healing of something like that. But it's important to remember there's really no timeline, and it is a-okay to seek services, to seek support, to seek advocacy wherever and whenever you are ready to.
Okay, we still have a little bit more time for maybe a question more or two if anyone else has anything to put in the chat or message directly to me.
Great questions, by the way. Thank you so much for all of your questions.
Okay, looks like I got one that says, though this is a new development, how do we deal with helping people through the trauma or impact that COVID has hit upon them?
Yeah, that is a complicated question to answer. Again, it's going to be different for everybody. We have to not only look at this one, like COVID, but what are the other things and the systems around them that are impacting their response? So family dynamics, connectedness in their community to school, their biology, past traumas, right? All of these things compound and come together to create that resiliency and or effective coping response. And so having, especially for youth right now, I think one of the most important things is a trusted adult. Having somebody that they can lean into, and then also having those opportunities for quality connection. So we have to be able to explore with them what they're feeling, help them learn what they're feeling, right? This is the perfect opportunity to start educating about mental health and how something like a large-scale crisis can impact our psychological well-being, what that looks like. How do we reach out for support? What are the resources out there at my school and in my community that I can use? But I think that the response is going to be it's going to vary widely from person to person based on their own personal experience, and what they're facing in all their other systems, like those environmental factors that are contributing, their level of risk factors versus protective factors. So the best thing I think we can do is have conversations. We can assess where people are at. Like, what are you dealing with? Especially if you're the adult, like if you're a teacher, I think it's a little more complicated because we have to dig a little bit deeper into what's going on, or connect them to a school counselor, school psychologist, a mental health specialist at school to have that deeper conversation. But as a parent, right, we have an understanding of what's happening in their environment, but also asking them, what's happening? How are you feeling? Can we try this together? And then continuing to monitor those different reactions that they're going to have, because even when this is over, right, like we're not necessarily going to be out of it once everyone's vaccinated. We're going to have to continue to potentially mask during flu seasons. We're going to have to get boosters. Like there are going to be changes beyond this year, that we're going to have to create a new normal of what that looks like. And that transition will be difficult. But I think providing chances for engagement, connection, opportunity to connect to services when needed, making sure we're normalizing mental health as something that is just as important as our physical health, will have way better outcomes is related to our mental health in years to come than if we don't do any of that right now and we kind of just wait for it to get bad. That's the thing too, is I think a lot of people are waiting for that really intense response from their youth. They're like, oh, they're resilient. Like, yeah, and youth are absolutely resilient. Yes. But let's have those conversations sooner, because like I said, a lot of lifetime mental illness, 50% of lifetime mental illness starts at age 14. 14. So, and that onset of symptoms to the time that they're receiving the treatment is 8 to 11 years. And in that time, that delayed time, it can get so much more severe. So let's start having those conversations sooner. Let's educate ourselves on what we should look for and what resources are available to us to connect them to sooner. Sorry, Jennifer, that was a long answer.
No, that's perfect, Stephanie. That is absolutely perfect. I don't have anything to add. And just like you said, I mean, my experience with COVID, another example, can be completely different than yours. I could have this vacation home I took off to while someone else is dealing with housing insecurity, food insecurity, job insecurity. So just really checking in, like Stephanie said, and having mental health resources available. And yeah,
I shared this in the plenary, but I was talking to a colleague and they said to me, it's like we're all weathering the same COVID storm, but no two people are in the same ship. We all have different ships, and we have to be empathetic and sensitive to everyone's different, varying experience. So.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie and Jennifer, for your time. This has been wonderful. Again, for anyone who's in the audience who is getting their CEUs from this session, please put your full name, email, and affiliation in the chat. And thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Okay. Claire, are we good to go?
Yes, you are good to go.
Okay, perfect. Thank you again for all your help.
Yeah,
no problem.
Great job, ladies. It's Christine.
Hey, Christine.
I'm not going to show you my face today, but it's so good to see you too.
It's great to see your name and hear your voice.
All right. Well, listen, appreciate all of your help and your wisdom and your presentations and all that good stuff.
Oh, thanks.
Well, thank you.
Good to hear.
Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye. Bye, Claire.